I brought 2 tickets to Paris and red roses to surprise my husband for Valentine's Day. Instead, I found the entire company drinking champagne and celebrating his engagement to the female chief executive officer. I watched him kiss her, then hold up a massive diamond ring as the crowd cheered. I did not scream or cry. I simply turned around and walked away. I instantly canceled the trip. I froze all our joint accounts, and I began withdrawing my 83% ownership share from his company, a share worth $612 million. 20 minutes later, my phone showed 112 missed calls. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to burn your old life down to build a better one. My name is Elise, and I am 33 years old. On paper, I was just an unassuming freelance data analyst. I wore simple, cozy sweaters, worked quietly from our suburban home, and kept a low profile while my husband Colin climbed the corporate ladder. Colin is 35 and the vice president of sales at Ether Dynamics, a tech firm that had exploded in growth over the last 3 years. I spent 7 long years supporting him. I paid our rent when he was broke, bought his tailored suits, and listened to his endless pitches while he chased his startup dreams. He swore that every late night and missed weekend was an investment in our shared future. I believed his promises until Valentine's Day arrived and shattered that illusion into a million pieces. I wanted to do something unforgettable for Colin this year. He had been working late every night for months, claiming the upcoming initial public offering required his constant, undivided attention. Our marriage had felt strained, distant even, but I chalked it up to corporate stress. I decided to surprise him at the office to remind him of us. I bought 2 tickets to Paris, which was his dream destination, and grabbed a bouquet of deep red roses from a boutique downtown. The drive to the sleek high-rise where Ether Dynamics occupied the top 3 floors felt full of hopeful anticipation. I stepped onto the plush carpet of the executive floor, clutching the thick envelope containing our flight details. Instead, the moment the elevator doors slid open, I was hit by a massive wall of sound. Loud laughter, cheering, and the distinct popping of champagne corks echoed down the glass-lined hallway. I walked slowly toward the main conference room. The entire sales team and executive board were gathered there. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, I saw Colin clearly. He was wearing the custom navy suit I had bought him for our 7th anniversary. But he was not looking over quarterly financial reports or discussing the public offering. He was down on one knee right in the center of the crowded room. Standing directly in front of him was Savannah, the 34-year-old, flashy external executive brought in to manage the company's transition. Savannah was wearing a red designer dress that clung to her, perfectly highlighting her expensive taste. Her face was buried in her hands in a highly theatrical display of shock and joy. I froze right there in the hallway, the bouquet feeling suddenly incredibly heavy in my arms. My breath caught in my throat as I watched my husband slide a blindingly large diamond ring onto Savannah's left hand. He stood up, wrapped his arms tightly around her waist, and kissed her passionately. The entire room erupted into wild, deafening applause. Colin turned to the adoring crowd, raising Savannah's hand high into the air like he had just won a championship trophy. He was beaming with a level of pride I had never seen before. The man I had shared a bed with for nearly a decade was publicly celebrating his engagement to his boss on Valentine's Day. My brain struggled violently to process the sheer audacity of the betrayal unfolding right in front of my eyes. As I stood paralyzed behind the glass, trying to comprehend how a married man could legally or logically propose to another woman at his workplace, someone shoved roughly past me. It was a junior marketing employee carrying a heavy silver tray of empty flute glasses. She stopped abruptly and looked me up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated disdain. Her eyes swept over my practical wool coat and simple boots, lingering mockingly on the flowers in my hands. "Excuse me," she scoffed, shifting the heavy tray to her hip. "You are just the freelance bookkeeper Colin hired out of pity, right? The catering entrance is in the back by the service elevators. You cannot be standing out here making a mess while the executives are celebrating a major life event." Her cruel words hit me like a physical strike to the chest. a pity hire, a freelance bookkeeper. In a matter of seconds, the true depth and dark reality of Colin's deception became crystal clear to me. He had not just hidden our legal marriage from his colleagues, he had actively demeaned my entire existence to them to protect his lies. He had painted me as some pathetic, desperate charity case he threw basic administrative work to out of the goodness of his wealthy heart. This was exactly how he explained away my occasional presence in the building, or my name showing up on various financial documents. He completely erased the fact that I was his lawful wife of 7 years. He erased the undeniable fact that I paid for the very luxury car he drove to work every single morning. He hid the truth because admitting he was married to a quiet homebody data analyst did not fit the flashy billionaire persona he was desperately trying to project to Savannah and the rest of the board. He had constructed an entire alternate reality where I was nothing more than a background character he pitied. The junior employee snapped her fingers sharply right in front of my face. "Hello? Did you hear me? Take those flowers to the back room before you ruin the aesthetic of the party." I looked at her impatient face, then looked back through the clear glass at Colin. He was laughing loudly, whispering something intimate into Savannah's ear, while pouring her another tall glass of incredibly expensive champagne. I did not cause a dramatic scene. I did not storm blindly into the room and throw the dozen red roses directly at his lying face. I did not scream at the top of my lungs that he was already legally bound to me. The betrayal was so absolute, so meticulously planned, and flawlessly executed, that it bypassed my capacity for tears entirely. A strange, icy calm washed over my entire body, settling deep into my bones. I looked at the rude junior employee and offered a small, tightly controlled, polite smile. "My mistake," I said evenly, my voice betraying zero emotion. "I will gladly show myself out right now." I turned away from the glass, walking purposefully over to the sleek stainless steel trash can located near the front reception desk. I took a deep, calming breath and dropped the beautiful dozen red roses directly into the garbage without ever looking back at him. Then I opened the thick envelope, pulled out the 2 expensive first-class Paris tickets, ripped them straight down the middle, and let the torn pieces flutter down gently on top of the crushed petals. I turned on my heel and walked back to the completely empty elevator bank, holding my head high, knowing I would absolutely never ever return. As the heavy stainless steel doors closed, shutting out the sickening sound of my husband's fraudulent engagement party, I pulled my phone from my coat pocket. I did not text Colin to demand an explanation. I opened my secure private banking application, the one Colin firmly believed just held our modest shared household funds. With steady, unshakable fingers, I navigated straight to the joint checking account. I zeroed it out, completely transferring the funds to a private holding. I moved to the joint savings account we had been building together. I zeroed it out without hesitation. I then accessed the highly restricted administrative portal for his corporate credit lines, the ones he thought were guaranteed by Ether Dynamics, but were actually backed by my personal collateral. With 3 quick definitive taps, I completely froze every single platinum card bearing his name. Finally, I opened an encrypted messaging application and selected the dedicated contact for my private wealth manager. I typed a single sentence: "Initiate the Obsidian Protocol." The message instantly marked as delivered. Colin thought he was a self-made genius swimming effortlessly with corporate sharks. He had absolutely no idea that he had just betrayed the ocean itself. I sat in the driver's seat of my sensible sedan in the underground parking garage of the Ether Dynamics building. The concrete walls felt cold and absolute, a sharp contrast to the heated luxury of the executive floor I had just escaped. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel tightly, but they did not shake. The icy calm that had washed over me upstairs remained perfectly intact. I stared straight ahead at the concrete pillar, watching the dust motes dance in the harsh fluorescent light. I did not turn the key in the ignition. I knew exactly what was about to happen. 20 minutes passed in absolute silence. It takes exactly 20 minutes for the caterers at a high-end corporate event to finalize their setup, present the invoice, and run the primary card on file. I had timed corporate events for Colin for 7 years. I knew the rhythm of his extravagant spending better than I knew my own heartbeat. Right on schedule, my phone lit up the dark interior of the car. The screen flashed with Colin's face. It was a photo from our vacation in Aspen last year, where he looked handsome and relaxed, completely supported by the invisible safety net I provided. I watched the screen glow and fade. It lit up again immediately. Then again. The vibrations merged into a continuous frantic buzz that rattled against the center console. I picked up the device and watched the notification counter climb rapidly. 10 missed calls, 30 missed calls, 50 missed calls. By the time the screen finally went still, a staggering 112 missed calls sat logged in my recent history. He was not calling to confess. He was not calling because guilt had suddenly pierced his conscience after publicly pledging his life to another woman while legally married to me. He did not even know I had been standing on the other side of that glass. Colin was calling in a state of sheer, unadulterated panic because his financial lifeline had just been severed. My phone buzzed again this time, signaling a new voicemail. I tapped the screen and pressed the phone to my ear. "Elise, pick up the phone right now." Colin's voice echoed in the quiet car, tight with suppressed rage and humiliation. I am standing in front of 50 of my top employees, and Savannah trying to pay for the engagement catering. The total is $30,000, and my platinum card just declined. The caterer tried to run it 3 times. The entire sales team is watching me look like an absolute fool. I called the bank and they said the primary account holder locked the corporate line. What did you do? Fix this immediately, or I swear to God there will be hell to pay when I get home. I deleted the voicemail. Hearing the raw panic in his voice, the desperate attempt to maintain his facade of limitless wealth brought a small, satisfied smile to my lips. He had spent years treating me like a glorified personal assistant, constantly reminding me how lucky I was to be attached to a rising star in the tech industry. Now the rising star was standing in the middle of his own fraudulent engagement party, unable to buy the champagne he had already opened. Before I could set the phone down, a rapid-fire barrage of text messages began flooding my screen. "What did you do to the accounts? Unfreeze them right now. Stop acting crazy and unlock my cards, Elise. This is not a joke. Savannah is looking at me like I am an idiot. Fix the accounts." I stared at the messages, watching his entitlement bleed through every capitalized letter. He demanded access to my money to pay for a party celebrating his infidelity. The sheer audacity of his demands solidified the cold resolve settling in my chest. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the 2 torn halves of the first-class tickets to Paris. I placed them on the dashboard of my car, making sure the destination and the dates were clearly visible under the harsh garage lighting. I snapped a clear, high-resolution photo of the ruined tickets. I attached the photo to our text thread. I did not write a long emotional paragraph detailing my broken heart. I did not ask him how long he had been sleeping with Savannah or why he felt the need to humiliate me. I simply typed a single sentence. "Enjoy the engagement. I am out." I hit send and watched the little bubble indicate the message had been delivered. I imagined him standing in the sleek conference room surrounded by his confused colleagues receiving that image. I pictured the exact moment the blood would drain from his face as he realized his quiet, unassuming wife had seen everything and had just detonated his financial security in a matter of minutes. For 60 seconds, my screen remained completely blank. The silence from his end was deafening. He was likely processing the catastrophic reality of his situation. He had been caught red-handed, and his bank accounts were entirely frozen. The power dynamic of our 7-year marriage had just completely flipped, and he was entirely unarmed. When his response finally came, it was not an apology. It was not a desperate plea for forgiveness or a frantic explanation of a massive misunderstanding. True to his nature, Colin instantly pivoted to vicious, aggressive defense. "You psychotic nobody." The message popped up blazing across my screen. "You think cutting off my cards means anything? You think you hold any real power here? You crunch numbers in your pajamas for pennies. I am the vice president of sales at the fastest growing tech firm in the country." Another message arrived instantly. "I built an entire tech empire from the ground up while you sat at home doing nothing. That measly 50 grand you lent me 5 years ago to start this journey means absolutely nothing to me now. I will pay you back out of my petty cash fund by next week. I watched the text bubbles appear one after another, each one more unhinged than the last. He was attempting to rewrite history right in front of me, trying to diminish my role in his success, to inflate his own fragile ego. He genuinely believed his own lies. He thought he was a self-made corporate titan, completely ignoring the fact that my algorithmic coding and my strategic investments were the only reasons Ether Dynamics existed. If you want to play dirty, Elise, we can play dirty. His next message read, "You are going to regret this. I will bring in the best lawyers in the city. I will legally destroy you and leave you with absolutely nothing. You will be back to living in that cramped apartment you came from." I let out a soft, humorless laugh. His threats were so entirely hollow, so fundamentally disconnected from reality that they bordered on comedic. He was threatening to bankrupt a woman who could buy his entire company 10 times over before lunchtime. The texts continued flashing rapidly as his anger blinded him to any sense of consequence. You picked the worst possible time to throw a tantrum. The initial public offering launches this Friday. In exactly 4 days, my company goes public, and I become an actual billionaire. My shares alone will make me untouchable. When that bell rings on Friday, I am going to buy you out, crush your miserable little life, and ensure you never work in this city again. I read his bold declaration about the upcoming initial public offering. The highly anticipated Friday launch was the talk of the financial sector. Colin and Savannah had spent months courting investors, promising revolutionary technological advancements and massive returns. They had staked their entire futures, their reputations, and clearly their personal credit on the success of this launch. What Colin completely failed to realize was that the initial public offering was entirely dependent on the continued backing of the majority shareholder. The mysterious silent angel investor who owned 83% of the company and held the exclusive patents to the core algorithm. The investor known only as Obsidian Holdings. He thought he was untouchable. He believed his upcoming billionaire status would shield him from any consequence of his betrayal. He had no idea that the very woman he was currently calling a worthless nobody held the absolute power to pull the plug on his entire existence. He did not know that I had already instructed my wealth manager to initiate the protocol that would systematically dismantle Ether Dynamics from the inside out. I placed my phone face down on the passenger seat, ignoring the continued vibrations. I did not need to read any more of his desperate threats. The reality of my situation was clear. 7 years of unwavering support, financial backing, and quiet loyalty had been rewarded with the ultimate public humiliation. But I was not the victim in this story. I was the architect of his impending ruin. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine purred to life, breaking the heavy silence of the concrete parking garage. I put the car in gear and drove slowly toward the exit ticket machine. The bright afternoon sunlight hit my windshield as I merged onto the busy city streets. I had a lot of work to do before Friday. I needed to pack my belongings, secure my assets, and prepare the final blow that would ensure Colin and Savannah's spectacular public downfall. They wanted to play corporate games and throw lavish engagement parties with my money. They wanted to build a tech empire on a foundation of lies and stolen resources. I would gladly let them build their house of cards all the way up to the sky. And on Friday, when the whole world was watching, I would be the one to knock it all down. The drive from the downtown glass towers to our quiet suburban cul-de-sac usually took 40 minutes. Today, I made it in 25. I pulled my car into the pristine driveway of the 4-bedroom colonial home Colin and I had shared for the past 5 years. The house was a monument to our carefully constructed compromise. I had paid the down payment with my early consulting contracts, while Colin insisted on putting the mortgage solely in his name to build his credit. I walked through the heavy oak front door and immediately felt the suffocating weight of his ego pressing down on the space. The foyer was decorated with framed magazine articles featuring his face and awards he had purchased for himself at charity galas. I ignored them all and marched straight up the curved staircase to the master bedroom. I pulled a single hard-shell suitcase from the top shelf of my closet and laid it flat across our perfectly made bed. I did not want half of our shared assets or the expensive jewelry he had bought me with my own money. I only wanted what was undeniably mine. I packed 3 tailored suits, 4 silk blouses, and my most comfortable pairs of slacks. I grabbed my encrypted backup hard drives, my proprietary algorithm ledger, and the physical copies of the holding company documents. I folded everything with meticulous precision. Every crease and every zipped compartment felt like a brick being removed from the heavy wall that had trapped me for 7 years. I was just reaching for my laptop charger when the heavy thud of a car door slamming echoed from the driveway. Heavy footsteps pounded rapidly up the front walkway, followed by the violent rattle of a key turning in the lock. The front door flew open with such force that it slammed loudly against the drywall, leaving a visible dent. Elise. Colin roared, his voice reverberating up the staircase. He did not sound like a man caught in a career-ending web of infidelity. He sounded like a furious dictator whose subjects had suddenly stopped paying taxes. I zipped my suitcase shut and walked calmly to the top of the landing. Colin stood in the foyer, breathing heavily. His custom navy suit was wrinkled, his silk tie was loosened, and his perfectly styled hair was disheveled. The charismatic, charming executive I had seen proposing just an hour ago was completely gone. In his place stood a red-faced, desperate man staring up at me with sheer, unadulterated venom. "What gives you the right to lock my corporate accounts?" he shouted, stabbing his finger in my direction. "Do you have any idea how humiliating it was to stand there while my platinum card declined in front of the entire executive board?" I walked down the stairs slowly, letting the silence stretch out until I stood on the bottom step, looking him directly in the eyes. It must have been incredibly embarrassing to realize you could not afford to finance your own fake life, Colin. I replied, my voice steady and cold. "I brought you Paris tickets for Valentine Day, and instead I found you proposing to your boss, so I stopped paying your bills. It is basic mathematics." Colin let out a sharp, patronizing laugh, running a hand roughly over his face. He paced across the hardwood floor, shaking his head as if I was the most unreasonable human being on the planet. "You really have no idea how the real world works, do you, Elise?" He stopped pacing and crossed his arms over his chest, adopting the condescending tone he usually reserved for his junior interns. That proposal was a carefully calculated strategic public relations stunt. It is entirely for the optics of the upcoming initial public offering. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline, but his expression remained dead serious. "Savannah is the external chief executive officer," he explained, speaking slowly as if I struggled to comprehend basic English. "The venture capital firms funding our launch demanded absolute assurance that she would not jump ship after we go public. They need to see a united, impenetrable front from the executive team. A fake corporate engagement secures investor confidence and guarantees her loyalty through the transition period. It is just business, Elise. It means absolutely nothing." He stepped closer, attempting to project an aura of logical authority. "You are throwing a hysterical fit over a simple corporate strategy. Savannah and I sat down with the board yesterday and mapped the whole thing out. Do you honestly think I would marry that woman? She is a tool for the company's success." I stood my ground, refusing to break eye contact. "You bought a flawless 3-carat diamond ring with my money to propose to your boss as a business strategy?" I asked, my voice dripping with icy skepticism. "You kissed her in front of 50 people to secure investor confidence. You are legally married, Colin. How exactly did you plan to explain a fake engagement when the press discovers your wife?" Colin waved his hand dismissively. "We had a non-disclosure agreement ready for you to sign tonight. We were going to keep you completely out of the media spotlight until the company stabilizes." He scoffed, taking another step toward me. "But of course you had to show up unannounced and act like a jealous, paranoid housewife. You have completely jeopardized a multi-billion-dollar launch because you cannot see the bigger picture." The utter audacity of his gaslighting was almost impressive. He was staring right at me, demanding I believe his fabricated corporate espionage plot over the evidence of my own 2 eyes. When I did not immediately apologize and unlock his credit cards, his false patience evaporated entirely. "You sit at home all day, Elise," He sneered, his upper lip curling in disgust. You crunch numbers for pennies in your pajamas for random clients. You have absolutely no concept of what it takes to build a tech empire from the ground up. I hustle every single day. I network with billionaires. I make the impossible happen. You are just a freelance bookkeeper who occasionally helps with my taxes. He stepped right up to the bottom of the staircase, towering over me. Do not think you can hold that measly 50 grand you lent me 5 years ago over my head forever. That money was pocket change compared to what I'm dealing with now. It means absolutely nothing today. I built Ether Dynamics with my sweat and my vision. You contributed nothing but a tiny drop in the bucket and a whole lot of nagging. I looked at the man I had spent 7 years loving. He had convinced himself of his own supreme greatness. He had completely erased the nights I stayed up writing the foundational code for his primary product. He had erased the fact that my holding company owned his entire existence. Colin marched into the kitchen and slammed his heavy leather briefcase onto the pristine marble island. He snapped the brass latches open and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He slapped them down onto the counter along with a sleek silver pen. He pointed to the documents with a victorious, arrogant smirk. This is a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and a finalized divorce settlement. He announced, his voice echoing loudly in the large kitchen. I am offering you $50,000. That covers your original little loan and gives you enough cash to get a cheap apartment across town. He slid the heavy stack of papers across the smooth marble surface until they hung over the edge right in front of me. I noticed exactly how his hand trembled very slightly as he pushed the documents closer, betraying the sheer, deep panic he was desperately trying to hide behind his loud, aggressive posturing. Sign it. Take the pocket change and walk away quietly today. If you make a scene and try to ruin my initial public offering this Friday, my lawyers will drag you through court for decades. We will freeze your freelance income. We will bury you in endless legal fees until you are begging for bankruptcy. You will leave with absolutely nothing. Sign the papers, Elise. I walked slowly over to the massive kitchen island. I looked down at the pathetic $50,000 offer printed on the crisp white paper. I looked at the expensive silver pen resting beside it, glinting under the bright overhead pendant lights. I did not reach out to touch it. I crossed my arms defensively across my chest, taking a deep breath to steady my racing heart, and offered Colin a chilling, entirely hollow smile. I am absolutely not signing anything today, Colin, I stated softly, my voice cutting through the thick, heavy silence of the room. Before he could inhale to scream another violent threat, the heavy oak front door suddenly swung open again. Helen stepped through the threshold first. She was a woman who wore her perceived social status like a heavy suit of armor draped in expensive cashmere and suffocating floral perfume. Right behind her was Trevor, sweating slightly as he hauled two large cardboard moving boxes through the doorway. He dropped them onto the entryway floor with a loud, careless thud, completely disregarding the polished hardwood beneath. Colin immediately straightened his posture, his face shifting from panicked desperation back to a mask of smug superiority. His reinforcements had arrived. It took less than 5 seconds for the sickening reality of the situation to crystallize in my mind. Helen did not look surprised to see my single suitcase resting on the kitchen island. She did not ask Colin why he was yelling or why there were divorce papers spread across the marble counter. Instead, she looked directly past me and offered her eldest son a beaming, congratulatory smile. She walked over to Colin and kissed his cheek, patting his arm with deep maternal pride. I brought the first load of Trevor's things, just like we discussed yesterday. Colin, Helen announced, her voice carrying that sharp, aristocratic tone she had practiced for years. Trevor wants to get the master bedroom painted before the weekend. Savannah mentioned she knows a wonderful interior designer who works exclusively with high-net-worth clients. We should absolutely call her first thing tomorrow morning. My hands rested flat against the cool marble of the island. They had known. My own mother-in-law and brother-in-law had known about Colin's double life with his chief executive officer. They had not just known about it, they were actively celebrating it. They were coordinating logistics. They had been sitting around family dinner tables with me for the past 6 months, smiling in my face, eating the food I paid for, while secretly planning my forceful extraction from my own home. Helen finally turned her attention to me. She looked me up and down, her gaze traveling from my sensible flat shoes to my unstyled hair, with an expression of absolute, unvarnished disgust. She reached out and tapped a perfectly manicured finger against the divorce settlement Colin had placed on the counter. You really should sign that, Elise, and be eternally grateful Colin is being so generous with his personal wealth, Helen said, her tone dripping with false pity. You have to look at this logically. Savannah is a chief executive officer. She is dynamic, she is powerful, and she looks the exact part of a billionaire's wife. She commands a room the second she walks into it. You look like a small-town librarian. You always have. You were fine for Colin when he was just starting out and needed someone to keep the house quiet, but he is a titan of industry now. He is entering a completely different stratosphere. She stepped closer, adjusting the heavy diamond necklace. She wore a piece of jewelry Colin had allegedly purchased for her last Mother's Day using a credit card I ultimately paid off. You simply cannot expect a man of his incredible caliber to stay tethered to a woman who has absolutely zero ambition. Helen continued, her voice hardening into a cruel edge. Colin has simply outgrown you, Elise. It happens every single day in the corporate world. Do not be selfish and bitter. Do not try to hold him back just because you cannot keep up with his massive success. Take the $50,000. It is more money than a freelance data entry clerk like you will ever see in one place again. Go start over somewhere more suited to your modest speed. Trevor pushed past his mother, walking into the kitchen with the arrogant swagger of a man who believed he had just won the lottery. He was wearing a designer athletic tracksuit and a pair of expensive sunglasses resting on top of his head. He leaned casually against the stainless steel refrigerator, crossing his arms and looking at me with the exact same condescending smirk his brother wore. You really need to pack your bags a lot faster, Elise, Trevor demanded, reaching out and grabbing a green apple from the fruit bowl I had filled just yesterday. I am officially moving into the master bedroom today. Colin and Savannah are closing on her downtown luxury penthouse tomorrow morning. They are going to need this place completely cleared out so I can get settled before the big initial public offering party on Friday night. Colin promised me this house as a bonus for helping him manage his personal affairs during the transition. I am going to tear out that boring garden of yours in the back and put in a massive custom hot tub. Colin stood behind them, nodding in silent agreement. He looked incredibly pleased with himself, having his mother and brother serve as his vicious attack dogs. He believed their combined cruelty would finally break my spirit and force my signature onto those fraudulent documents. He thought I would crumble under the weight of their unified family rejection. He thought I would cry, beg, or quietly surrender to their demands. I looked at the three of them. A family of parasitic grifters who had spent 7 long years feeding off my quiet labor, my financial stability, and my endless patience. They had taken my silence for weakness. They had mistaken my unassuming wardrobe and preference for ultimate privacy as undeniable proof of my insignificance. They were practically salivating over the massive billionaire windfall they believed was arriving by Friday, completely blind to the fact that they were standing directly on a trap door I had already opened. I reached for the zipper of my suitcase. The sharp metallic sound of the bag closing echoed loudly in the large kitchen, cutting cleanly through their arrogant, self-satisfied laughter. I lifted the heavy suitcase off the island and set it gently on the floor. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I simply looked at Trevor, who had just taken a loud, obnoxious bite of his apple. You cannot move into this house, Trevor, I stated, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any emotional tremor. Trevor chewed with his mouth open, laughing a wet, mocking laugh. Oh, really? And who exactly is going to stop me? You. Colin already gave me the keys, Elise. It is his house. He paid for it with his tech money. I reached into the side pocket of my leather handbag and pulled out a crisp manila folder. I opened it carefully and extracted a single notarized legal document printed on thick watermarked paper. I placed it directly on top of the pitiful $50,000 divorce settlement Colin had offered me. Colin's name is not on the deed to this property, I said, watching the smug, victorious smile slowly begin to melt off Colin's face. It never has been. You see, when we bought this place 5 years ago, Colin's credit was completely destroyed from his previous 3 failed startup attempts. No bank in the country would give him a loan for a bicycle, let alone an $800,000 luxury suburban home. So a private limited liability company purchased the house outright in cash. Colin was simply listed as a permitted resident. Helen scoffed loudly, waving her hand in a defensive, dismissive gesture. That is a ridiculous lie. Colin makes millions of dollars. He pays the mortgage every single month. Colin does not pay a mortgage because there is no mortgage. Helen, I corrected her, my gaze locking onto my husband's rapidly paling face. Colin pays a monthly maintenance fee to the holding company. He has been renting this house for 5 years, believing he was building equity. He was not. I tapped the legal document I had placed on the counter. The private limited liability company that owns this property is called Obsidian Real Estate Holdings. They just issued a highly expedited 30-day eviction notice to Colin for violating the moral turpitude and unauthorized occupancy clauses of his residency agreement. I slid the crisp paper toward Trevor. You are not moving into the master bedroom, Trevor. You are going to spend the next 30 days helping your brother pack his expensive suits into cardboard boxes before the county sheriff arrives to physically remove him from the premises. The silence that suddenly fell over the kitchen was absolute and suffocating. The obnoxious crunching sound of Trevor eating his apple stopped completely. Helen's mouth hung slightly open, her wide eyes darting frantically back and forth between the legal document on the counter and her favorite son. Colin stared at the eviction notice, his hands gripping the edge of the marble island so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. His brain was desperately trying to process the name of the holding company. I could see the gears grinding violently in his head as he recognized the word Obsidian. It was the exact same name as the silent angel investor that owned 83% of Ether Dynamics. I picked up my leather handbag and grabbed the extended handle of my suitcase. I did not wait for Colin to connect the final dots. I did not wait for Helen to start screaming or for Trevor to start throwing a tantrum. I turned my back on the 3 of them and walked steadily toward the front door. Elise. Colin finally choked out, his voice sounding incredibly small and entirely stripped of its former power. Wait, what does this mean? Who owns Obsidian? I opened the heavy oak front door, letting the cool afternoon air rush into the stifling house. I paused on the threshold, looking back over my shoulder at the family of arrogant opportunists standing completely frozen in my kitchen. It means you have exactly 30 days to vacate my property, Colin, I said smoothly, stepping out onto the front porch. I pulled the door shut behind me, leaving my in-laws standing in sudden, profound, and uncomfortable silence. I left the driveway without a single backward glance. The afternoon sun caught the rearview mirror, but I only looked forward. The drive downtown was smooth and fast. I bypassed the mid-tier business suites and pulled my car up to the valet stand at the Grand Monarch Hotel. It was the most exclusive property in the city, a place Colin had always talked about visiting once he finally made it. The valet opened my door and took my keys with a practiced nod. I walked into the soaring marble lobby and bypassed the main desk, entirely heading straight for the private concierge reserved for platinum tier members. I handed the attendant my sleek black card. It was my personal account. The attendant recognized the heavy metal card immediately. He escorted me to the private elevator bank and sent me directly to the top floor. The penthouse suite spanned 3,000 square feet of panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. It cost more for one night than the pitiful settlement Colin had just slid across our kitchen island. I dropped my single suitcase by the grand piano and walked over to the expansive glass wall. Far below, the city moved in a steady rhythm of tiny cars and hurrying pedestrians. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the complimentary bar and let the absolute silence of the room wash over me. The frantic, aggressive energy of Helen and Trevor was completely gone. I was back in my own element, operating at a frequency they could not even begin to comprehend. My phone vibrated on the glass table. I looked down, expecting another barrage of panicked text messages from my soon-to-be ex-husband. Instead, an unknown local number flashed across the bright screen. I answered the call, bringing the phone to my ear without saying a word. Elise. The voice on the other end was sickeningly sweet, but layered with a sharp, condescending edge. It is Savannah. I hope you do not mind that I took your private number from Colin's emergency contact file. I felt we really needed to have a woman-to-woman chat. I took a slow sip of my water, looking out over the sprawling city. Please go ahead, Savannah, I replied, my voice completely flat and devoid of the hysterical anger she was clearly expecting. She let out a small, practiced sigh, as if she were speaking to a particularly slow and stubborn child. Look, Elise, I know today was probably very hard for you. Seeing Colin move on, seeing him step into his true potential with someone who matches his drive. It must be devastating for a woman in your position. But you have to look at this realistically. Colin is a shark. He is a predator in the corporate world. He is building a massive empire, and a man like that needs to swim with other sharks. He cannot be tethered to a small pond. He cannot be weighed down by someone who does not understand the intense demands of extreme wealth and power. You two are completely mismatched. You belong in a quiet suburb balancing freelance spreadsheets. We belong in elite boardrooms making massive billion-dollar decisions. I listened to her arrogant monologue, marveling at her absolute delusion. She had bought into Colin's fabricated narrative completely. She genuinely believed he was the mastermind behind Ether Dynamics. She thought she had stolen a prize catch when in reality she had just anchored herself to a sinking ship. You see? Elise Savannah continued, her tone growing even more patronizing. I am not a cruel person. I actually feel terrible that you had to find out this way. Colin was going to handle it properly tonight with the settlement papers, but your little surprise visit forced his hand. I know $50,000 might seem like a lot of money to someone with your limited lifestyle, but I want to make this transition as smooth as possible for everyone involved. I want you to walk away without making any embarrassing public scenes that might disrupt our initial public offering on Friday. We simply cannot afford any negative press right now. I set my water glass down on the sleek glass table. And how exactly do you plan to ensure my silence, Savannah? I asked, keeping my tone perfectly mild and submissive. She laughed, a bright, tinkling sound of sheer superiority. I am prepared to offer you an additional $200,000, Elise. It will come directly from my own personal account. Not Colin's money. My money. Consider it a generous severance package for your years of keeping his house clean while he built his company. Take the charity and go. Buy yourself a very nice little condo somewhere far away. Go and start a brand new quiet life. Do not be a sad, jealous ex-wife clinging to a man who has clearly outgrown you. Do not try to fight us on this. If you try to take this to court, you will be completely destroyed. I let a few seconds of silence pass, allowing her to revel in her perceived victory. You seem very confident in your legal position, Savannah, I said softly. She scoffed loudly, her arrogance radiating through the phone. I am highly confident because I know exactly who currently stands firmly behind us today. You clearly have no idea how corporate finance works, so I will spell it out for you. Ether Dynamics is backed by a massive silent angel investor, a private equity firm called Obsidian Holdings. They own 83% of our company. They hold all the critical patents, and they fully support our executive leadership. Obsidian Holdings wants this initial public offering to succeed just as much as we do. If you try to interfere with Colin's shares or make a public spectacle, they will unleash a team of elite corporate litigators that will crush you into absolute dust. You are a freelance data analyst, Elise. You cannot fight a multi-billion-dollar holding company. They will bury you so deep in legal filings you will never see the light of day again. Take my charity money and disappear before you make the biggest mistake of your entire pathetic life. I stood in the center of the luxurious penthouse suite, listening to the woman who was sleeping with my husband threaten me with my own holding company. The irony was so rich, so perfectly constructed, that it took every ounce of my willpower not to laugh directly into the receiver. She was standing in a building I financed, wearing a diamond ring bought with my collateral, offering me a bribe using funds she believed she controlled. She was weaponizing Obsidian Holdings, completely blind to the fact that I was the sole architect of that very entity. I decided to give her exactly what she wanted. I let my shoulders drop and pitched my voice down, mimicking the tone of a defeated, broken woman who had just realized she was completely outmatched. "You are right, Savannah," I said, my voice trembling just slightly for dramatic effect. "I cannot fight a massive holding company. I do not want to be dragged through court and ruined. I just want this nightmare to be over. I will stay quiet. I will not ruin your big day on Friday." Savannah let out a triumphant, satisfied breath. "I am glad you are finally seeing reason, Elise. It is the smartest decision you have ever made. I will have my lawyers draft the transfer documents for the $200,000 tomorrow morning. Just sign Colin's settlement tonight and we can all move on. I am sure Obsidian Holdings knows exactly what they are doing," I murmured softly. "Goodbye, Savannah." I ended the call before she could say another word. I dropped the phone onto the couch and immediately walked over to my suitcase. I pulled out my secure encrypted laptop and flipped it open. The screen flared to life, illuminating the dark, polished wood of the desk. I did not waste a single second. I bypassed the standard communication software and opened a direct secure line. I typed in a complex 12-digit sequence and hit dial. The line rang exactly twice before a crisp professional voice answered. Gavin speaking. Gavin was my elite corporate auditor. He was a forensic accountant who could track a single missing cent across 30 different international shell companies. He was ruthless, efficient, and utterly loyal to Obsidian Holdings. "Gavin, I need a complete real-time trace," I commanded, my voice dropping the defeated wife act and returning to its natural, sharp authority. "Savannah just offered me a $200,000 bribe from her personal account to walk away quietly. I want to know exactly which account she is pulling that pity money from. Track every transaction Colin and Savannah made over the last 6 months. Leave absolutely no stone unturned." The next morning, I walked through the towering glass doors of the Vanguard Tower downtown. My sensible shoes clicked against the polished Italian marble floor as I bypassed the main reception desk entirely. I stepped into the private express elevator and swiped my encrypted access card. The heavy steel doors slid shut, securing my ascent to the top floor. The 68th floor belonged entirely to my private legal and financial team. I stepped out into a sleek, minimalist lobby where 3 of the most ruthless corporate attorneys in the city were already waiting for me alongside Gavin. They fell silent the moment I arrived, adjusting their expensive suits and offering respectful nods. I was no longer the quiet, unassuming wife holding a suitcase in a suburban kitchen. I was the apex predator they answered to. We moved directly into the main conference room. The walls were constructed of soundproof polarized glass, offering a sweeping, unobstructed view of the city I practically owned. I took my seat at the head of the massive mahogany table. Gavin immediately handed me a thick leather-bound dossier. The gold-embossed lettering on the cover simply read, "Obsidian Holdings." For 5 years, I had operated as the sole principal and absolute dictator of this entity. I had carefully constructed a labyrinth of blind trusts and offshore holding companies to mask my identity. The public believed Ether Dynamics was Colin's brilliant brainchild. The media praised him as a visionary tech pioneer. But the proprietary algorithm that formed the entire foundation of his company was mine. I wrote every single line of that code during the early days of our marriage while he slept. I had deliberately chosen to hide my wealth and my absolute ownership. I knew from the very beginning that Colin possessed a dangerously fragile ego. He needed to feel like the powerful provider, the brilliant mastermind who rescued me from a life of mediocrity. I loved him enough to give him that illusion. I handed him the keys to a kingdom I built and stepped back into the shadows to let him wear the crown. It was an ultimate test of his true character. I wanted to see what kind of man he would become when given unlimited power and resources. He failed the test spectacularly. He took the empire I handed him and used it to fund his own arrogant infidelity. Now I was preparing to take everything back. Gavin stood at the head of the table and activated the large digital presentation board. You instructed me to trace the $200,000 bribe Savannah offered you last night, Elise. Gavin began, his voice clinical and sharp. I initiated a deep forensic sweep of her personal assets and cross-referenced them with the corporate ledgers of Ether Dynamics. What I found goes far beyond simple corporate mismanagement. The money Savannah offered you did not come from her personal savings. She is drowning in private debt. That bribe was pulled directly from a shadow account tied to the primary operational funds of Ether Dynamics. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a cold surge of adrenaline. Explain the exact mechanism, Gavin, I instructed, keeping my eyes locked on the digital board. For the past 8 months, Colin and Savannah have been systematically siphoning capital away from Obsidian Holdings. Gavin explained, outlining the data with a red laser pointer. They established 4 fake shell vendors billing Ether Dynamics for fabricated consulting services and phantom software licenses. They approved these massive invoices themselves, exploiting their executive authority to bypass standard accounting protocols. The funds were then funneled through a series of international holding accounts before landing directly in their own private offshore trust. They are embezzling millions, Elise. My legal team shifted uncomfortably in their high-backed leather chairs, exchanging grim looks. Embezzlement on this scale, especially right before an initial public offering, was an absolute corporate death sentence. Gavin brought up a new series of slides displaying photographs alongside financial receipts. They have been using Obsidian Holdings money to completely fund their lavish secret lifestyle. The down payment on the downtown luxury penthouse Trevor mentioned was wired from one of these shell accounts last week. The custom sports cars they both drive were leased through a phantom corporate subsidiary they created together. They have been taking private jet flights to tropical resorts and expensing them as critical investor meetings. Gavin paused and brought up a highly detailed macro photograph of the engagement ring Colin had slipped onto Savannah's finger the previous night. I recognized that flawless 3-carat diamond instantly. And the engagement ring your husband used to propose to his chief executive officer. Gavin added, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave. The purchase was heavily disguised as a specialized hardware acquisition for a new server farm. They bought the symbol of their infidelity using your money. They have directly violated every single fiduciary duty they owe to Obsidian Holdings. They are treating the operational capital of Ether Dynamics like their own personal piggy bank, assuming the angel investor will never look closely at the quarterly expense reports. I nodded slowly, absorbing the catastrophic reality of their actions. Colin was always reckless, but this level of calculated fraud required a specific type of legal clearance. He could not just move millions of dollars and prepare for a massive initial public offering without my direct financial signature. We lived in a community property state. My legal status as his wife meant I had an automatic vested interest in his executive assets and his founder shares. The underwriters would have demanded an absolute ironclad waiver from me before allowing the company to go public. They would need proof that I could not suddenly lay claim to half his empire after the bell rang. Show me the pre-launch disclosure filings, Gavin. I commanded, a sudden sharp suspicion slicing through my mind. Show me the exact legal documentation Colin submitted today. Show me what he gave the underwriters to clear his personal assets for the public launch. Gavin typed rapidly on his keyboard, pulling up a dense, highly redacted file directly from the Securities and Exchange Commission database. He scrolled through hundreds of pages of dense legal boilerplate until he reached the final appendix. He magnified a specific legal document onto the large presentation board. It was a comprehensive spousal asset waiver and full release of claims. I stared intently at the glowing screen, reading the dense legal paragraphs. The document explicitly surrendered any and all rights I held to Colin's executive compensation, his founder shares, and any future profits generated by Ether Dynamics. It legally isolated me from his impending billionaire status, but it also contained a very specific clause declaring that I had full knowledge of his financial standings and approved of all recent capital transfers. It was a shield designed to protect him from any future litigation I might pursue once the embezzlement was eventually brought to light. It was his ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. I looked down at the bottom of the projected document. There, resting neatly on the designated signature line, was my name. It was written in a fluid looping script that looked incredibly similar to my own handwriting. Beside it was the official stamp of a corporate notary public affirming that I had personally appeared and signed the document in their presence. I felt a cold, heavy knot of absolute certainty form in the pit of my stomach. I had never seen this document in my life. I had never sat down with a notary public to sign away my legal rights. Colin had not just lied to me. Gavin, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet whisper. I did not sign this document. I have never seen this waiver before in my entire life. The private conference room fell into a stunned, breathless silence. Marcus, the lead attorney, turned extremely pale, staring at the signature on the screen. Elise, if you did not sign that document, Marcus began, his voice tight with sudden, intense realization, then Colin forged your personal signature on a federal regulatory filing. I kept my eyes locked on the completely forged signature glaring from the bright digital board. Colin had committed massive, undeniable federal wire fraud. He had blindly handed me the absolute perfect weapon to completely annihilate his entire existence. He thought he could steal millions, fund his illicit affair, and freely forge my name without any consequences. I closed my heavy dossier and looked right up at my legal team. Prepare the federal injunctions for immediate filing, I ordered coldly. We will let them ring that bell on Friday. Then we will gladly watch the feds walk them right off the trading floor in handcuffs. The silence in the penthouse was not a surrender. It was the calm before the storm. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows watching the city lights blur into streaks of neon as the adrenaline of my encounter with Gavin faded into a cold, singular focus. Across the city in our former suburban house, Colin, Helen, and Trevor were undoubtedly spiraling. Their hubris was a physical weight, a terminal velocity they hadn't yet realized they had reached. My phone vibrated, shattering the stillness. It wasn't Gavin. It was a notification from a mutual friend, Sarah, who had been a regular guest at our dinner parties. Elise, I saw the posts. I'm so sorry. I had no idea things had gotten this bad for you. Do you need a place to stay? I frowned, my thumb hovering over the screen. I opened the link. She'd included a direct hit to a smear campaign of surgical, if amateurish, precision. Helen had taken to her platform with the ferocity of a cornered animal. The post was a masterclass in projection and vitriol. It detailed a fabricated timeline where I, the mentally unstable and obsessive wife, had suddenly snapped locking Colin's professional accounts in a fit of jealous rage after discovering he had moved on to a more compatible partner. She included a photoshopped image of me from a charity event last year, intentionally choosing an angle that made me look frazzled. The comments section was already a toxic wildfire of performative pity for Colin and condemnation for my supposed extortion attempt. I scrolled through, my jaw tightening. Trevor had chimed in as well, posting in the private family group chat, which I had been conveniently removed from, and screenshots were already leaking to the public through his concerned acquaintances. He claimed I was a professional freeloader who had been skimming off Colin's business profits for years, using my position as his wife to sabotage his professional standing. It was a narrative designed to frame me not just as a spurned woman, but as a criminal threat to the upcoming IPO. Every mutual friend, every business contact I had nurtured over 7 years was being fed a steady diet of character assassination designed to ensure that if I surfaced to tell the truth, I would be dismissed as a delusional, scorned ex-wife seeking a payday. My phone buzzed again, a sharp, singular sound that felt like a challenge. It was a direct text from Colin. The message included an image file, a high-resolution scan of the forged spousal asset waiver, the very document I had realized was a criminal fabrication during my meeting with Gavin. The taunting text attached to it read, "Checkmate. You get nothing. The IPO launches Friday, and you're officially erased from my history. Don't bother calling the lawyers. They're all on my payroll now. You're a footnote, Elise." I let out a low, humorless laugh that echoed against the glass. He had just handed me the weapon to ensure his total destruction. By sending me that forged document, he had confirmed his complicity, his intent, and the exact method of his fraud. He hadn't just committed wire fraud by submitting a forged spousal waiver to federal regulators. He was now using that evidence to taunt me, creating an electronic record of his intent to deceive. I didn't reply to him. Instead, I opened my laptop and initiated a new encrypted session with Gavin. My fingers moved across the keys with rhythmic precision. The smear campaign was a pathetic attempt at distraction, a desperate flailing by people who knew their financial lifeline was tightening around their necks. They were trying to get ahead of the story, ensuring that when the news of their embezzlement broke, the public would view it through the lens of a bitter divorce battle rather than a federal crime. "Gavin, I need you to prioritize the wire transfers for the last 96 hours. I said, my voice barely above a whisper yet, commanding the room despite being thousands of miles away. Colin just sent me a scan of the forged waiver. He thinks he's successfully erased me. I need to know exactly which SEC regulatory filing contains this forgery. We are going to provide the regulators with the original signature files from my personal banking accounts to trigger an immediate federal audit." "I'm already on it, Elise." Gavin's voice crackled through the encrypted speakers. "The moment that waiver hits the underwriters, we'll be ready. I've been tracking the diversion of funds from Obsidian Holdings. They've been using the company's internal accounts to cover the operational deficits caused by their embezzlement. It's a classic Ponzi-style shell game. They are essentially borrowing from the angel investors' primary holdings to hide the fact that they've drained the liquid capital." I looked down at the forged signature on the waiver. It was a bold, arrogant attempt, one that counted on my silence and my compliance. Colin believed that because I had always played the part of the supportive, quiet wife, I lacked the steel to fight back when the stakes turned lethal. He had built his entire future on the belief that I was too emotionally invested in our marriage to burn it down. He couldn't have been more wrong. "How long until the IPO launch?" I asked, pacing the length of the suite. 72 hours, Gavin replied. "The market buzz is at an all-time high. They've been inflating the valuation metrics for months based on the algorithm you provided. They are going to IPO at a valuation of $3 billion. If they pull this off, they will have successfully laundered the stolen millions into legitimate publicly traded shares, making it significantly harder for us to claw the assets back without triggering a massive market collapse." "Then we don't trigger the collapse until the bell rings," I said, my eyes fixed on the city skyline. "I want them to see the ticker tape. I want them to see their net worth hit the stratosphere. I want them to feel like they are untouchable. And then at 9:31 a.m. on Friday, we send the package to the SEC, the FBI, and every major news outlet in the country. We don't just win, Gavin, we rewrite their entire reality." The smear campaign continued to gain traction. I could see the headlines starting to manifest: tech titan's estranged wife, accused of sabotage and domestic dispute, threatens multi-billion-dollar IPO. It was exactly the type of sensationalist garbage that fueled market volatility, and it was exactly what Colin wanted to sow. He needed the board to view me as a liability, someone to be silenced with a quick payout and a gag order. He didn't realize that every malicious post, every fabricated quote from Trevor and Helen, was building a dossier of malice and intent that would be impossible for any defense attorney to overcome. "They're getting bolder," Gavin warned. "I'm seeing social media ads now. They've engaged a digital reputation management firm to boost the smear campaign. They're spending tens of thousands of dollars, likely funds. They don't actually have to bury your name in search results. Let them spend it." I said, sipping my water. Let them dig their hole as deep as they possibly can. The more they spend on this public farce, the more evidence we have of their intent to mislead investors. They aren't just slandering me. They're manipulating public perception of a public entity before an IPO. That's not just defamation, Gavin. That's market manipulation. I could see the pieces falling into place with the cold, crystalline logic of the code I had written for Ether Dynamics years ago. Colin had turned his back on the foundation of his own success, failing to realize that the person who built the machine is the only one who truly knows how to break it. He was focused on the IPO, on the billionaire status, on the vanity of the public stage, all while I was dismantling the floor beneath him. Check the ledger one more time, I instructed. I need the exact path of the last $5 million they embezzled. If they moved it into the venture firm's accounts, we might be able to freeze it before they attempt the IPO launch. I don't want to just stop them. I want to ensure they have no liquidity left to hire counsel once the investigation starts. Working on it, Gavin confirmed. I sat down at the desk, opening a clean document. I started drafting a timeline, not for a lawsuit, but for an indictment. I detailed the dates, the fake vendors, the forged documents, and the explicit communications. Every line of the timeline was backed by a digital trail that couldn't be erased. Colin had been so consumed by his arrogance that he'd left the front door to his financial life wide open, never once thinking that the wife he dismissed as a librarian was the one who held the master key to his entire empire. As the hours ticked away toward Friday, I allowed myself a brief moment of reflection. For 7 years, I had been the silent partner, the invisible hand behind the curtain, the one who turned a floundering startup into a multi-billion-dollar tech giant. I had done it out of love, out of a desire to build a life with a man I thought was my equal. Now, in the cold light of this betrayal, I was finally reclaiming my work, my wealth, and my name. They think they've erased me, I murmured to the empty, quiet suite. But they've only just started to realize how much of their reality I've been defining all along. I pulled up the latest financial statement of Obsidian Holdings. It was a clean, minimalist document that held more power than any executive board meeting Colin could ever hold. He had thought he was the shark navigating the murky, predatory waters of the tech industry. He hadn't realized that I was the one who had written the currents. I looked at the time. Tuesday evening was fading into night. Friday was approaching with the inevitability of a guillotine. Everything is set, Gavin, I said, finally closing the laptop. Make sure the legal team is ready for the Friday morning filing. No mistakes, no delays, and keep tracking those transfers. I want to know exactly when the money leaves their accounts for the last time. The silence returned, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt like space, the vast, infinite space of a future that finally belonged entirely to me. I turned toward the window again, watching the city below, a grid of lights that seemed to pulse in anticipation of a collapse they couldn't possibly foresee. Colin was right about one thing: he needed to swim with sharks. He just hadn't realized that I was the one who had populated the ocean. Thursday evening descended on the city like a velvet curtain, but the executive floor of Ether Dynamics blazed with desperate light. The corporate boardroom had been transformed for the pre-launch investor gala. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over arrangements of white orchids and silver trays piled high with beluga caviar. Waiters in black uniforms circulated with vintage champagne moving past floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the financial district. To the untrained eye, it was a flawless celebration of impending triumph. It looked like the glorious coronation of a new tech king ready to conquer the market. But beneath the polished veneer of unlimited wealth, a quiet, suffocating panic permeated the room. The extravagant display was a high-stakes theatrical performance designed to hide a fatal truth. Colin and Savannah were out of money. The forensic locks Gavin placed on their accounts functioned exactly as intended. Their corporate credit lines were frozen. The shadow accounts they used to siphon operational capital were locked down pending federal review. Panicking and desperate for immediate cash, they assumed the bank had made an administrative error that would be resolved by morning. In the meantime, they recklessly maxed out their personal credit cards just to pay the catering staff, florists, and valet service for tonight. They were throwing $1 million party while secretly drowning in a liquidity crisis. They needed an influx of bridge funding tonight to satisfy underwriters and keep servers running until the opening bell tomorrow. I watched the live security feed from my laptop in the Vanguard Tower penthouse, sipping sparkling water as cameras captured every bead of sweat on my soon-to-be ex-husband's forehead. Colin stood near the ice sculpture, his tailored tuxedo failing to hide the frantic tension in his shoulders. Savannah clung to his arm, wearing an emerald silk gown and the stolen 3-carat diamond ring, flashing a practiced smile at everyone making eye contact. To distract from cash flow issues and preemptively discredit me before divorce proceedings began, they launched a vicious, coordinated public smear campaign. My secure phone had been vibrating relentlessly for 3 hours, buzzing with notifications from horrified mutual friends. Helen and Trevor had taken to every social media platform, posting fabricated stories, portraying me as a mentally unstable, gold-digging freeloader, actively trying to extort Colin on the eve of his greatest triumph. They claimed I was a jealous, obsessive nightmare, attempting to sabotage his billionaire status because he had finally found a compatible partner in Savannah. In the front row of the arranged seating area, Helen and Trevor were holding court. They reveled in their unearned, elevated status, blind to the impending disaster. Helen was draped in a Chanel evening gown purchased on credit. Trevor sported a bespoke velvet dinner jacket and a platinum Rolex watch gleaming under the chandeliers. I turned up the encrypted audio feed, zeroing in on their conversation with a group of seasoned venture capitalists. "Oh, we always knew Colin was destined for greatness," Helen boasted, waving her champagne glass. "He just needed to shed the dead weight holding him back. His previous wife contributed nothing. She actually tried to extort him this very week out of pure petty jealousy. But Colin handled her swiftly." Trevor chimed in eagerly, nodding to impress the surrounding executives. "Exactly right, Mother. The woman was a professional freeloader living off my brother's genius. Now that she is out of the picture, Ether Dynamics is going to dominate the global market." The elite investors offered polite smiles, entirely unaware that the genius they were praising had not written a single line of the code making the company valuable. Suddenly, my phone lit up with a direct message from Colin. I opened the text and stared at the display. He had sent a high-resolution picture of the redacted federal filing, focusing on the forged spousal asset waiver. Beneath the image of my faked signature, he typed a deeply arrogant, taunting message. "Checkmate. You get nothing. The initial public offering launches on Friday, and you are officially erased from my history. Do not bother calling the lawyers, they are all on my payroll now. You are just a pathetic footnote, Elise." I let out a low, cold laugh echoing against the windows of my penthouse. He thought he was being ruthlessly intimidating. He thought he was delivering the final crushing blow to a defeated woman. He had no idea that by sending me that text message from his personal device, he unknowingly handed me the final, undeniable piece of federal electronic evidence needed to prove his explicit intent to commit wire fraud. A sharp chime rang through the expansive boardroom as Colin stepped up to the acrylic podium. The ambient music faded out immediately, and the gathered crowd of stakeholders, media representatives, and prospective investors turned their undivided attention to the front. Savannah took her place one step behind him, looking every bit the proud master architect of his imminent success. Colin gripped the edges of the podium, taking a deep, dramatic breath before leaning into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice projecting false, absolute confidence. "Tomorrow morning we do not just launch a public offering, we launch a global revolution." When I first conceptualized the core architecture of Ether Dynamics, I was sitting alone in a cramped suburban office. I had nothing but a vision and a relentless drive to change the fundamental landscape of predictive analytics. People told me the algorithm I was designing was far too complex for a self-made developer to pull off. I sat perfectly still in my penthouse suite, watching him lie to a room full of the most powerful financial titans in the city without missing a single beat. He was taking full, unadulterated credit for the thousands of hours I spent coding, debugging, and perfecting the proprietary algorithm while he was out drinking and networking at country club golf courses. He proudly monetized my sleepless nights and boldly sold my intellectual property as the exclusive product of his own brilliant mind. This revolutionary technology, he continued loudly gesturing broadly to the glowing presentation screens behind him, is the ultimate culmination of my life's work. It is the direct result of surrounding myself with elite visionaries like Savannah, who intrinsically understand that extreme success requires extreme sacrifice. We stripped away the inefficiencies, we removed the domestic obstacles holding us back. We are standing on the precipice of a historic $3 billion valuation because we refused to compromise my original vision. The room erupted into thunderous applause. Helen clapped louder than anyone else, her heavy diamond bracelets clinking together sharply. Colin smiled a wide, triumphant grin that failed to reach his panicked, terrified eyes. He quickly stepped down from the podium and moved toward the shadowy back of the room, where a tight cluster of 3 major institutional investors was waiting silently. These were the powerful men who controlled the massive liquid capital heavily required to secure the last-minute funding and stabilize ether dynamics before the morning bell. I adjusted the digital audio feed, focusing entirely on their quiet, intense private conversation. It was a brilliantly executed pitch. Colin, the lead major investor, a stern, silver-haired man named Sterling, said, his tone incredibly dry, cold, and utterly unimpressed by the theatrical display. The market projections are remarkably solid, and the revolutionary algorithm performs exactly as your documentation promised. But we have a critical problem regarding the final bridge funding agreements. Colin's bright smile faltered instantly, his underlying panic bleeding rapidly through the polished, expensive exterior. "A problem, Mr. Sterling?" he asked, his voice suddenly tight. "We have provided all the required thorough financial disclosures. The spousal waiver was officially submitted and completely approved by the Federal Regulatory Commission just this afternoon. We have mitigated all possible personal liabilities." Sterling shook his head slowly, holding up a single manicured hand to forcefully stop Colin from speaking further. "The personal liabilities are not our primary concern right now, Colin. We are fully aware of your unfortunate domestic distractions and the smear campaign currently running online. Our concern is the fundamental ownership structure of your entire enterprise. Ether Dynamics is propped up by your silent angel investor. Obsidian Holdings legally controls 83% of your operation, and they hold the exclusive federal patents to the exact algorithm you just loudly claim to have invented yourself. We are absolutely not wiring $50 million in emergency bridge capital tonight, or committing our institutional weight tomorrow morning, until we look that specific corporate entity right in the eye. We require complete transparency before we sign a single check. We unequivocally refuse to sign the final bridge paperwork until we personally meet the elusive representative from Obsidian Holdings tonight. Colin froze completely still, the color rapidly draining from his face. He looked at Savannah, utterly terrified and completely helpless. They had never actually met the principal of Obsidian Holdings. They had only ever communicated through anonymous legal proxies, blind trusts, and highly encrypted email servers. Savannah, however, remained fiercely and blindly arrogant, stepping confidently forward with a smug, deeply condescending, bright smile. "Do not worry, gentlemen," she announced to the powerful room, her voice dripping with sheer, unearned corporate superiority. "We fully anticipated this exact operational request. The silent partner is not a mystery to us. We have arranged for a highly exclusive private introduction to completely finalize the deal. The primary executive representative of Obsidian Holdings is arriving right now." Savannah's voice echoed through the boardroom, dripping with unearned superiority. She stood tall, gesturing toward the back, fully expecting a faceless corporate proxy to walk through the heavy doors and validate their fraudulent existence. The major investors, including Sterling, turned their attention toward the entrance. A heavy, expectant silence fell over the gathered crowd of stakeholders, media representatives, and elite venture capitalists. Colin adjusted his tailored tuxedo jacket, pasting on a confident smile, ready to shake hands with the entity that effectively owned his life. He was ready to seal his billionaire status and cement the lie he had been living for years. He believed he had won. He believed his forged documents, offshore shell companies, and vicious public smear campaign had successfully paved the final mile to his absolute financial triumph. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive perfume vintage champagne and the desperate, suffocating hubris of a man standing on the edge of a cliff blindly celebrating the view. The heavy mahogany boardroom doors did not just open. They were pushed wide with a forceful precision that commanded the immediate attention of every person in the room. I walked in. I was no longer wearing the unassuming practical sweaters and muted tones that Colin had always preferred me to hide behind. I was dressed in immaculate designer powerwear. I wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit that cut a striking silhouette paired with stilettos that clicked against the hardwood floor, with the rhythmic, terrifying cadence of a ticking clock. My posture was rigid, my chin held high, and my gaze was locked directly onto the man standing frozen at the acrylic podium. I was not alone. I was flanked by a formidable, undeniable wall of absolute authority. To my immediate right walked Gavin, clutching his encrypted tablet, his face a mask of forensic calculating precision. To my left marched Marcus and two other top-tier corporate attorneys, carrying thick leather briefcases and radiating absolute legal dominance. But the real weight of my entrance, the element that instantly sucked the oxygen out of the grand boardroom, were the two stoic individuals trailing just half a step behind us. They were federal agents dressed in crisp dark suits, their presence signaling an immediate catastrophic shift in the atmosphere. They moved with a quiet, observant intensity, their eyes scanning the room and taking inventory of the crowd. Up at the front, the confident smile slid completely off Colin's face, replaced by a look of sheer shock. For 3 agonizing seconds, his brain completely failed to process the visual information in front of him. Then the shock melted into a deep, visceral panic, and finally into an explosive, purple-faced rage. The vein in his neck bulged visibly against his starched white collar. He gripped the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned stark white. "Security!" Colin roared, his voice cracking with a sudden hysterical pitch that echoed violently through the microphone and blasted through the boardroom speakers. "Get my crazy ex-wife out of here immediately. Stop her. This event is for major stakeholders only. She has absolutely no business being in this building." His outburst shattered the sophisticated ambiance of the investor gala. Down in the front row, Helen leapt to her feet, her face contorted with furious indignation. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at me, her heavy diamond bracelets sliding down her wrist. "You vindictive little psycho!" Helen yelled, her shrill voice cutting through the rising murmur of the confused investors. "You are an absolute embarrassment. How dare you show up here tonight? You are ruining my son's biggest achievement because you are a jealous, pathetic failure. Get her out of here before she destroys everything." Trevor jumped up beside his mother, puffing out his chest in his velvet dinner jacket, trying to physically block the central aisle. "You really overplayed your hand this time, Elise," Trevor shouted, pointing aggressively. "You think you can just crash a private corporate event to beg for a payout? Security grab her, throw her out on the street where she belongs." Savannah stood frozen next to the podium, her emerald silk gown suddenly looking less like a victory dress and more like a brightly painted target. Her eyes darted frantically from me to the federal agents, a sickening realization dawning on her features. She tried to signal the private security guards standing along the perimeter of the room, frantically waving her hands, but the situation had already spiraled completely out of their control. 2 burly security guards in dark uniforms stepped forward from the sidelines, moving swiftly to intercept my path down the center aisle. They reached out, preparing to physically restrain me and drag me out of the boardroom at Colin's frantic command. I did not break my stride. I did not flinch. I did not even look at them. Before the guards could lay a single finger on my tailored suit, the 2 federal agents stepped smoothly ahead of me. In perfect synchronized movements, they reached into their breast pockets and flashed their golden badges directly into the faces of the approaching security personnel. The guards stopped dead in their tracks, their eyes widening in sudden, absolute understanding. They immediately took 3 large steps backward, raising both of their hands in a gesture of total surrender, refusing to interfere with an active federal operation. Trevor, seeing the massive security guards retreat in fear, took a hesitant step backward himself. His false bravado evaporated into thin air as Marcus, my lead corporate attorney, fixed him with a lethal warning glare that promised absolute legal ruin if he dared to intervene. The entire room descended into a chaotic, murmuring frenzy. The elite venture capitalists and media representatives began whispering frantically to one another, pulling out their smartphones to record the unbelievable spectacle unfolding before them. Sterling, the lead major investor who had just demanded to meet the silent partner, stood completely still nearby. His sharp, calculating eyes moved rapidly from Colin's sweating purple face to my calm, unwavering approach. He was a man who deeply understood power dynamics, and he could clearly see that the power in this room had just violently shifted. He watched the federal agents secure the perimeter, and a look of profound comprehension settled over his features. I continued my walk down the central aisle, my heels clicking against the floor. I ignored Helen's continuing shrill insults as she realized no one was going to remove me. I ignored Trevor's stammering, pathetic threats as he slinked back into his chair. I ignored the blinding flashes of phone cameras capturing my every move. I kept my eyes entirely focused on Colin. He looked like a trapped animal, his chest-heaving sweat beating heavily on his forehead, his entire fabricated billionaire reality crashing down around him. Savannah took a massive step backward, putting distance between herself and Colin, her survival instincts kicking in as she stared at the law enforcement officials flanking my legal team. The grand, expensive illusion they had spent months desperately building was evaporating into smoke with every single step I took toward the front of the room. The extravagant catering, the crystal chandeliers, the designer clothes bought on stolen credit lines, it all meant absolutely nothing now. I reached the front of the room, bypassing the acrylic podium entirely, and stepped directly up to the massive polished mahogany table where the venture capitalists were seated. The expensive crystal glasses and silver trays of beluga caviar sat untouched, abandoned in the wake of the overwhelming tension. Colin tried to speak again, his mouth opening and closing in rapid succession, but no sound came out. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own impending destruction, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked gasps as his false reality crumbled. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a frantic, silent plea that I utterly ignored. Without breaking eye contact with my hyperventilating husband, I held my hand out to Gavin. He stepped forward and handed me the thick, heavy leather-bound dossier containing every single piece of forensic financial evidence we had meticulously compiled. The bank transfers, the shell company registrations, the receipts for their lavish lifestyle, the proof of my original algorithm code, and most importantly, the high-resolution scans of the forged federal spousal asset waiver he had texted to my personal phone just hours ago. I raised the massive 500-page dossier high into the conditioned air and dropped it directly onto the polished mahogany surface of the main presentation table. The heavy thud echoed like a gunshot through the sudden, breathless silence of the grand boardroom. I planted my hands firmly on the table, leaning forward slightly, letting my gaze sweep over Savannah, then Helen, then Trevor, before finally locking onto Colin's terrified eyes. "I am not leaving Colin," I said, my voice ringing out with cold, absolute authority slicing through the quiet room. "I am here as a major stakeholder. In fact, I am the only stakeholder that matters." The heavy silence that followed my declaration was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a catastrophic impact. Colin stared at the massive dossier resting on the polished wood, his eyes darting frantically between the thick stack of documents and my unwavering gaze. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords failed to produce a single sound. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a ledge and was waiting for the ground to rush up and meet him. Beside him, Savannah finally registered the sheer gravity of the situation. The smug, condescending smile she had worn like a crown completely dissolved. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a sickly paper white. Her fingers trembled uncontrollably against the delicate stem of her crystal champagne flute. The glass slipped from her weak grasp. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, violent crack, shattering into hundreds of glittering shards. The sudden noise echoed through the grand boardroom, snapping the frozen room back to reality. "Who exactly do you think you are, Elise?" Colin finally stammered, his voice, a pathetic, raspy whisper, completely devoid of his usual arrogance. He gripped the edge of the acrylic podium so hard, his knuckles looked as though they might burst through his skin. "You cannot just walk in here and spout absolute nonsense. This is a secure corporate event. You have zero equity in Ether Dynamics. I have the signed federal waivers to prove it." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply turned away from my hyperventilating husband and addressed the entire stunned room. I looked directly at Sterling, the lead institutional investor, who had previously demanded to meet the silent partner. "My name is Elise Vanguard." I announced, my tone carrying the crisp, undeniable authority of someone who held the fate of everyone in the room in the palm of her hand. "I am the sole proprietor, the primary architect, and the chief executive officer of Obsidian Holdings." A collective gasp erupted from the gathered crowd. The elite venture capitalists, the media representatives, and the corporate stakeholders began murmuring feverishly, shifting in their seats and leaning forward to hear every single word. The federal agents standing firmly by the doors crossed their arms, radiating a silent, heavily armed validation of my identity. Trevor, who had been slouched in his chair, suddenly sat bolt upright, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. Helen covered her mouth with both hands, her heavy diamond bracelets clinking softly against her teeth as she stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. Their vicious public smear campaign, their pathetic attempts to paint me as a freeloading, unstable housewife, evaporated in the span of 5 seconds. "That is a complete lie!" Colin shouted, his panic escalating into pure, frantic desperation. He pointed a shaking finger at me, trying to rally the confused investors to his side. "Do not listen to a single word she says. She is my estranged wife. She is having a mental breakdown. She has absolutely zero connection to Obsidian Holdings. They are a massive private equity firm based overseas. She is just a freelance data analyst trying to ruin my initial public offering. Security, I demand you remove her right now." I ignored his pathetic screaming entirely. I signaled Gavin with a slight nod of my head. Gavin stepped forward, bypassing the stunned corporate executives, and walked directly to the main audiovisual control terminal built into the mahogany table. Colin had spent thousands of dollars upgrading this boardroom, ensuring the presentation technology was seamless for his investor pitches. He had unknowingly built the perfect stage for his own public execution. Gavin connected his encrypted tablet to the primary interface. He bypassed Colin's presentation software with a few rapid keystrokes, executing a hard system override. The massive digital screens behind the podium flickered wildly for a split second before Colin's heavily branded Ether Dynamics logo was violently wiped away. In its place, Gavin projected the master holding documents for Obsidian Holdings. The high-resolution scans filled the enormous screens displaying the original articles of incorporation, the international banking ledgers, and the absolute ownership registry. There, at the very top of the corporate hierarchy, listed as the sole primary beneficiary and absolute controlling director, was my full legal name. The room erupted into chaos again. Investors pulled out their reading glasses, squinting at the glowing screens. Media representatives began typing furiously on their laptops, capturing the massive corporate scandal unfolding right in front of them. My husband has spent the better part of 5 years standing at podiums just like this one, claiming to be a self-made visionary, I said, projecting my voice clearly across the room. He has built an entire personal brand on the fabricated narrative that he single-handedly engineered the predictive algorithm powering Ether Dynamics. I gestured toward the glowing screens. Gavin tapped his tablet again. The holding documents vanished, replaced instantly by a series of highly complex technical schematics and official United States patent filings. The patents displayed on the screens were the foundational intellectual property of ether dynamics. They were the exact mathematical formulas and predictive coding sequences that made the company worth billions of dollars. But the registered inventor listed on every single federal patent was not Colin. It was me. I wrote every single line of that revolutionary algorithm. I continued, my voice ringing with cold, hard truth. I engineered the core architecture while Colin slept. I created the intellectual property that you are all currently preparing to invest your institutional capital into. I chose to remain entirely anonymous. I chose to fund his startup through a blind trust because I believed in supporting my husband. I wanted to see what he would do with unlimited resources and absolute executive power. Colin looked like he might physically collapse. He stumbled backward away from the podium, his breathing shallow and rapid. Savannah was backed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking frantically for an exit that did not exist. The venture capitalists in the room were no longer looking at Colin with respect or anticipation. They were looking at him with sheer, unadulterated, predatory disgust. They realized they had been pitched a massive, elaborate lie by a man who was nothing more than an arrogant figurehead. But taking credit for my intellectual property was not his fatal mistake, I announced, pacing slowly toward the podium. I could forgive extreme arrogance. I cannot, however, forgive extreme federal fraud. Gavin hit the final button on his tablet. The patent filings disappeared from the massive digital screens. In their place, a new, highly redacted legal document appeared. It was the spousal asset waiver Colin had submitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission just hours prior. The document explicitly surrendered my rights to his executive compensation and founder shares. It was the shield he intended to use to protect his stolen wealth during our impending divorce. I want every major stakeholder in this room to look very closely at the signature line on that federal regulatory filing, I commanded, pointing sharply at the screen. That document was submitted to the underwriters today to clear this company for a public offering. It claims I have full knowledge of Ether Dynamics' financial standings, and that I willingly waive all my legal rights to the corporate assets. My signature sits right there, next to a corporate notary stamp. Sterling, the lead investor, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing dangerously as he scrutinized the projected document. He looked back at me, his expression deadly serious. "Are you stating for the record that you did not sign that disclosure waiver?" Ms. Vanguard Sterling asked, his voice dropping into a low, threatening register. "I have never seen that document before today," I replied, meeting his gaze with absolute, unwavering certainty. My husband forged my signature on a federal financial document to hide the fact that he and his chief executive officer have been systematically embezzling millions of dollars from the operational funds of Ether Dynamics. They created phantom shell vendors. They routed corporate capital to private offshore accounts. They bought luxury cars, penthouses, and diamond rings using the money you believed was securing your investments. The entire financial foundation of this company is a hollow, rotting shell. The fallout was instantaneous. Helen let out a loud, dramatic wail, burying her face in her hands, as the absolute reality of her son's criminal actions finally destroyed her delusions of grandeur. Trevor sat frozen, his face pale, realizing that the luxury lifestyle he had been bragging about all evening was entirely funded by massive federal wire fraud. The venture capitalists immediately stood up, grabbing their briefcases and shouting aggressively at their own legal aides to freeze all pending transactions. The entire initial public offering was effectively dead in the water. Colin was hyperventilating, openly crying as the federal agents moved away from the doors and began walking slowly and deliberately down the center aisle toward the podium. I stepped up to the microphone, standing exactly where Colin had stood just minutes before. The feedback whined sharply for a second before settling into a clear, crisp broadcast that cut through the shouting and the chaos. The entire room fell silent, turning to look at the woman who had just single-handedly dismantled a $3 billion tech empire in under 10 minutes. I look out at this room and I see a massive, elaborate house of cards built entirely on my own foundation. I announce smoothly into the microphone, my voice echoing off the polarized glass walls. I own 83% of this company, valued at $612 million. And as the majority shareholder, I am officially withdrawing my algorithm, revoking your intellectual property licenses, and pulling all capital effective immediately. The reverberations of my announcement hit the boardroom like a seismic shockwave. For a fraction of a second, absolute silence reigned, the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that follows a catastrophic explosion. Then the room completely fractured. Sterling, the lead venture capitalist, slammed his heavy crystal glass down onto the mahogany table so violently the stem snapped. He did not look at Colin. He looked directly at his legal aides, who were already scrambling to open their encrypted laptops. "Freeze the escrow accounts right now!" Sterling barked, his voice slicing through the rising din. "Pull every single term sheet. Do not let a single dime of our institutional capital cross into Ether Dynamics until I personally authorize it." The other investors mirrored his sudden frantic urgency. Men and women in bespoke suits were practically climbing over each other to reach the privacy of the hallway, pressing secure cellular phones to their ears, shouting urgent commands to their respective banking teams. The beautifully orchestrated illusion of a multi-billion-dollar public offering disintegrated into a desperate scramble for financial survival. They instantly recognized that without my proprietary algorithm, Ether Dynamics was not a groundbreaking tech giant. It was a worthless, empty shell, a hollow corporate facade built entirely on stolen intellectual property. Collins staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. His tailored tuxedo suddenly looked like a clown suit. He collided with the acrylic podium, sending a stack of carefully curated marketing brochures spilling across the polished floor. "Wait, please, you do not understand," Colin choked out, raising his hands toward Sterling in a pathetic, pleading gesture. "We have contingency plans. We have backup code. I am the visionary. I can build it again." "You did not build it the first time," Sterling fired back, his silver hair bristling with raw, predatory anger. "You sold us a ghost, Colin. You pitched a revolutionary product that you legally do not even own. You are a fraud." Down in the front row, Helen was hyperventilating. The heavy diamond bracelets she had flashed around all evening suddenly looked like weighted shackles. She grabbed Trevor by the arm, her immaculately manicured nails digging into his velvet jacket. "Trevor, do something," she demanded, her shrill voice bordering on hysteria. "Call the lawyers. Tell them she is lying." Trevor simply stared blankly at the massive digital screens projecting my undeniable ownership documents. The blood completely drained from his face. The reality of his impending financial ruin, the crushing weight of the credit card debt he had accumulated playing the role of a tech billionaire's brother, paralyzed him. Savannah, however, refused to accept defeat. Her survival instincts, honed by years of manipulating corporate ladders, kicked into overdrive. She realized that if Colin went down, her entire fabricated lifestyle, the penthouses, the private jets, the unearned executive title, went down with him. She lunged forward, her emerald silk gown flashing under the chandeliers, and ripped the microphone from the stand on the podium. The harsh feedback whined through the speakers, forcing several investors to cover their ears. "Do not listen to a word this woman says," Savannah shouted into the microphone, her voice echoing with a frantic, desperate edge. She pointed a trembling finger directly at me. "Look at her. She is not a chief executive. She is a bitter, scorned, jealous ex-wife who cannot handle the fact that Colin moved on to a more sophisticated, capable partner. She is fabricating these documents. She hacked into our presentation system to cause a scene because she wants to ruin the most important night of Colin's life." The room hesitated. Savannah's sheer audacity, her willingness to double down on the smear campaign in the face of federal evidence, caused a momentary ripple of confusion among the less informed attendees. Helen immediately seized the opening, standing up and joining Savannah's frantic narrative. "Exactly!" Helen screamed, pointing at me from the front row. She has been unstable for years. She has been freeloading off my son, contributing absolutely nothing to his success. Now she is trying to extort him with fake patents and fake holding companies. Security, I demand you arrest her for corporate espionage. Trevor, emboldened by his mother, and Savannah stood up, attempting to puff out his chest. She is just trying to force a massive divorce settlement, he yelled to the venture capitalists. It is a pathetic, desperate shakedown. Colin is the genius here. Savannah gripped the microphone tighter, her knuckles turning white. She locked eyes with Sterling, projecting a mask of desperate sincerity. We have an entire legal team ready to prove she has zero equity, Savannah pleaded. She is a malicious, unstable liability. We will have her removed, and we will proceed with the initial public offering exactly as planned. You know Colin's genius. You know the value of this company. Do not let a jealous housewife destroy a $3 billion market opportunity. I stood perfectly still, letting her desperate, frantic words wash over me. The federal agents flanking my legal team did not flinch. Gavin simply smirked, tapping his tablet to ensure the security feeds were capturing every single lie. I looked at Savannah, taking in her shaking hands, her pale face, and the absolute terror hiding just behind her aggressive posturing. She thought she could outmaneuver me with the same cheap, superficial character assassination they had been peddling on social media all week. She thought public humiliation would force me to retreat into the shadows. I stepped forward, closing the distance between the main presentation table and the podium. I did not need a microphone to command the room. I reached out and calmly flipped the thick, leather-bound cover of the massive forensic dossier I had dropped onto the mahogany surface. I am not jealous, Savannah, I stated, my voice smooth, steady, and chillingly calm. I am conducting an audit. The silence that rushed back into the room was absolute. It was the heavy, breathless quiet of a trap springing shut. I turned my attention away from Savannah's pale, terrified face and looked directly at the cluster of institutional investors who had returned to the table, drawn back by the sheer gravity of my statement. For the past 18 months, your esteemed chief executive officer and his brilliant partner have been crying poverty to the board while demanding constant infusions of venture capital, I announced, scanning the detailed financial ledger on the first page of the dossier. You believed your investments were funding server expansions, top-tier developer salaries, and global marketing initiatives. You believed you were financing the future of predictive analytics. I turned the page, the heavy paper snapping loudly in the quiet room. On the 12th of October, Colin authorized a wire transfer of $4.2 million from the primary Ether Dynamics operational fund, I read aloud, my voice echoing off the glass walls. The money was routed through a shell vendor listed as Apex Consulting, a corporate entity registered in the Cayman Islands. A corporate entity that, according to federal tax records, is wholly owned by Savannah. Savannah dropped the microphone. It hit the floor with a loud, sickening crack, the sound completely ignored by the stunned crowd. From that Cayman account, I continued, my gaze locking onto Sterling, whose face was turning an alarming shade of crimson. $2.8 million was immediately transferred to a private luxury real estate broker in Monaco to purchase a beachfront villa. The remaining $1.4 million was used to pay off the massive, crippling private gambling debts incurred by Trevor over the last 3 years. Trevor collapsed back into his chair, as if his legs had suddenly been cut out from under him. He buried his face in his hands, realizing his secret financial ruin had just been broadcast to the most powerful men in the city. Helen stared at her son in absolute horror, her jaw hanging slack. Colin gripped his hair, his breathing ragged and loud. "Elise, please." He begged, his voice a pathetic whimper. "Stop. Just stop. We can negotiate. We can fix this." I ignored him, turning to the next page of the forensic audit. On the 3rd of January, an additional $7 million of your bridge funding was systematically siphoned through a fraudulent corporate payroll account, I stated, raising my voice to ensure the federal agents by the door heard every detail. The funds were used to purchase a customized Gulfstream jet registered to a blind trust controlled by Colin. And just last week, knowing this company was entirely out of liquid capital and facing a catastrophic server failure, Colin used a frozen corporate credit line to purchase a 3-carat emerald-cut diamond ring. I pointed directly at Savannah's left hand where the stolen jewel caught the light. They are not tech pioneers, I concluded, closing the heavy dossier with a definitive thud. They are common thieves who used your institutional wealth to fund a fabricated luxury lifestyle. The sheer force of the exposure shattered the fragile, greedy alliance holding Colin and Savannah together. The moment the words federal fraud and common thieves echoed through the boardroom, the intoxicating illusion of their shared power vanished, replaced instantly by the terrifying, icy reality of impending federal prison sentences. Savannah did not just step away from Colin, she physically recoiled, as if he had suddenly caught fire. Her meticulously crafted composure, the smug superiority she had worn like armor all evening, completely disintegrated. Her chest heaved violently. The emerald silk of her designer gown rustled sharply as she spun to face the man she had planned to ride to the top of the global market. "You lied to me!" Savannah shrieked. The sound was guttural, raw, and completely unhinged. She lunged forward and violently shoved Colin hard in the chest with both hands. Colin, already off balance and reeling from the collapse of his initial public offering, stumbled backward and crashed into the side of the acrylic podium. "You told me you owned the proprietary technology. You swore to me the capital was entirely yours to control." She turned her frantic, wild eyes towards Sterling and the other venture capitalists desperately trying to salvage her own freedom. Her voice pitched into a frantic, pleading wail. "I had absolutely no idea. He manipulated me. He told me the offshore accounts were standard international tax mitigation strategies. He completely misrepresented the corporate ownership structure. I am a victim of his fraud." Colin stared at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock and rising terror. The woman who had spent the last 18 months feeding his ego, validating his worst impulses, and actively helping him drain the corporate accounts, was now publicly feeding him to the wolves to save her own skin. "Savannah, what are you doing?" Colin gasped, his voice cracking horribly. "You authorized the transfer to Monaco. You picked out the beachfront villa. You signed the shell company documents in the Caymans." "Because you explicitly ordered me to, as the chief executive officer," Savannah screamed back, pointing an accusatory finger directly at his face. "I was following corporate directives. You completely manipulated my trust. You used me to hide your pathetic theft from your wife." The sheer hypocrisy of her sudden moral outrage was staggering, but perfectly in character. Savannah was a predator, realizing she had backed the wrong prey, and she was now violently chewing off her own leg to escape the trap. The elite investors watched the spectacular implosion with expressions of absolute disgust. They were no longer looking at visionary tech founders, they were watching two cornered criminals tear each other apart in the center of the boardroom. Savannah took another aggressive step toward Colin, her face contorted with malice. "You promised me a $3 billion valuation. You promised me global executive power. You are nothing but a pathetic, incompetent liar who stole his wife's work because you are too stupid to write a single line of functional code yourself." The brutal truth of her words, shouted in front of the most powerful financial titans in the city, stripped away the absolute last shred of Colin's fabricated dignity. The entire room watched his complete psychological collapse. The polished, confident tech titan vanished entirely. In his place stood a terrified, ruined man who finally realized he had absolutely nothing left to leverage. Colin slowly turned his gaze back to me. The frantic anger that had fueled him just moments before had completely evaporated, replaced by a deep, hollow, suffocating despair. He looked down at the massive 500-page forensic dossier resting on the mahogany table, representing the absolute end of his freedom, his wealth, and his reputation. Then, in front of the federal agents, in front of his elite investors, in front of his mother, his brother, and the mistress who had just violently betrayed him, Colin's knees buckled. He dropped hard to the polished hardwood floor. The sound of his knees hitting the ground echoed sharply. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, ignoring the ruined fragments of Savannah's shattered champagne flute that crunched beneath him. He grabbed the hem of my tailored trousers, his hands shaking uncontrollably, his face completely slick with sweat and tears. "Elise, please!" Colin sobbed. The sound was wretched, a wet, gasping cry that ripped from the back of his throat. He looked up at me, his face streaked with absolute terror. Please, Elise, you have to stop this. You cannot do this to me. We were married for 7 years. I love you. I still love you. I swear to God I still love you. I stood completely still, looking down at the man who had spent the last year systematically attempting to destroy my life, erase my contributions, and steal my intellectual property. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no residual affection, not even anger, just a cold clinical detachment. She manipulated me, Elise! Colin cried wildly, gesturing toward Savannah, his voice thick with desperate tears. She got into my head. She told me you were holding me back. She convinced me to move the money. I was weak. I made a terrible mistake. But I am your husband. You know me. I am not a criminal. Please just withdraw the dossier. We can fix this. I will give you whatever you want. I will give you the entire company. Just do not let them send me to federal prison. He buried his face against my shoes, weeping loudly, completely abandoning any remaining sense of self-respect. He was begging for his life, weaponizing the history of our marriage in a pathetic attempt to save himself from the catastrophic consequences of his own profound greed. Elise, please, Colin gasped, looking up again, his eyes red and swollen. I will sign anything. I will publicly admit you wrote the algorithm. I will leave Savannah right now. Just please call off the federal agents. Do not destroy my life. I did not move. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I let him kneel there in the center of the grand boardroom, fully exposed to the harsh, unforgiving judgment of his peers. The investors stared in absolute revulsion. The corporate attorneys behind me remained stoic, their expressions unreadable masks of legal authority. Gavin watched with cold satisfaction, recording every second of the spectacular humiliation. While Colin wept openly on the floor, the catastrophic ripple effect of his ruin suddenly hit the front row of the audience. Helen and Trevor had been watching the scene unfold in a state of paralyzed, uncomprehending shock. But as the absolute finality of my statement sank in, the true, horrifying reality of their own personal financial situations crashed down upon them with the force of a falling anvil. Trevor staggered to his feet, his face turning the color of wet ash. He looked frantically at the heavy dossier on the table, then down at his brother sobbing on the floor. His hands shot to his head, gripping his perfectly styled hair as panic completely consumed his features. The loans. Trevor gasped, his voice barely a squeak. Mom, the loans. Helen snapped her head toward her youngest son, her eyes wide with sudden gripping terror. What are you talking about, Trevor? The margin loans. Mom, Trevor shouted, his voice cracking as pure hysteria took over. I leveraged everything. I took out $3 million in high-interest margin loans against the projected value of my pre-initial public offering shares. The bank required immediate liquidity guarantees. I used the house as collateral. I used your retirement accounts as secondary collateral. Helen let out a sound that was half shriek, half gasp. She grabbed the back of the chair in front of her to keep from collapsing. You did what? Trevor, tell me you did not pledge my retirement funds. Colin promised me the shares would quadruple in value by tomorrow morning. Trevor screamed, his bespoke velvet dinner jacket suddenly looking like a physical manifestation of his impending bankruptcy. He swore the public offering was a guaranteed lock. The bank is going to call the margin loans the second the market opens tomorrow. We have no liquidity. We have absolutely nothing. They are going to take the house. They are going to take everything. Trevor began to hyperventilate, clutching his chest as he stumbled backward. His entire identity, built on the false premise of endless wealth and unearned superiority, vanished. He had aggressively mocked me just moments ago, calling me a professional freeloader, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just financially destroyed himself and his mother based on his brother's massive illegal lie. Helen sank back into her seat, staring blankly ahead. The heavy diamond bracelets on her wrists, undoubtedly purchased on credit lines tied to the now dead tech empire, felt like absolute lead. Her grand illusions of joining the ranks of the ultra-wealthy elite evaporated, leaving her staring directly into the abyss of total financial devastation. Her perfect golden child was going to federal prison, and her youngest son had just gambled away her entire life savings on a ghost company. The boardroom was a symphony of complete destruction, investors shouting Savannah frantically denying her complicity. Trevor hyperventilating, Helen frozen in absolute horror, and Colin sobbing uncontrollably at my feet. It was the exact precise outcome I had meticulously engineered over the last 4 days. I had not just stopped their initial public offering, I had systematically detonated their entire reality. I looked down at Colin. His tears had soaked the expensive leather of my stilettos. He looked up, his face a pathetic mask of pure, desperate hope, waiting for a shred of mercy that did not exist. I felt the cool, heavy weight of absolute vindication settle firmly into my chest. The years of gaslighting, the emotional manipulation, the theft of my intellectual property, and the vicious public smear campaigns had all led directly to this singular defining moment. I smoothly stepped backward, pulling my foot away from his desperate grasp. Colin fell forward, his hands hitting the empty floor where I had just stood. He looked up, his expression shattering as he finally realized there was no salvation coming. I looked coldly down at the ruined man who had completely underestimated me for 7 years. I did not offer a grand speech. I did not offer a bitter monologue. I simply stepped neatly around his trembling, kneeling form, ensuring my designer suit did not brush against his tuxedo. I raised my chin, making eye contact with the 2 federal agents standing patiently at the edge of the central aisle. I gave them a single sharp, authoritative nod. "They are all yours." The 2 federal agents moved with terrifying efficiency. They stepped past my designer suit and laid their heavy hands on Colin's trembling shoulders. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the silent boardroom, a definitive sound that severed Colin's billionaire fantasy forever. The sheer force of the exposure shattered the fragile alliance holding Colin and Savannah together. The moment the words "federal fraud" echoed through the room, the intoxicating illusion of their shared power vanished, replaced instantly by the icy reality of impending federal prison. Savannah physically recoiled from Colin as if he had caught fire. Her meticulously crafted composure disintegrated completely. "You lied to me!" Savannah shrieked. The sound was guttural and unhinged. She lunged forward and violently shoved Colin hard in the chest. Colin stumbled backward, crashing into the side of the acrylic podium. "You told me you owned the proprietary technology. You swore the capital was yours." She frantically turned her wild eyes towards Sterling and the other venture capitalists desperately trying to salvage her own freedom. Her voice pitched into a pleading wail. "I had no idea he manipulated me. He told me the offshore accounts were standard tax mitigation strategies. I am a victim of his fraud." Colin stared at her in profound shock. The woman who had spent months validating his worst impulses and actively helping him drain corporate accounts was now publicly feeding him to the wolves to save her own skin. The brutal truth of her betrayal stripped away the last shred of Colin's fabricated dignity. The polished tech titan vanished entirely. In his place stood a terrified, ruined man with nothing left to leverage. The second federal agent moved with equal unyielding precision. He approached Savannah, who immediately began backing away. "Do not touch me!" Savannah screamed, her voice cracking as the agent secured her wrists in cold steel. "I demand a lawyer. I demand full immunity." The agent did not respond, merely escorting her out of the luxurious boardroom. The elite investors watched in absolute, horrified silence as the self-proclaimed visionary and his chief executive were marched down the center aisle like common thieves. Sterling, the lead investor, pulled out a stark white handkerchief and methodically wiped his hands as if physically cleaning off the residue of Colin's deceit. He looked at me with a mixture of deep professional respect and primal fear, silently acknowledging that he had nearly lost $50 million. Without another word, he signaled his team and walked out of the room, leaving the shattered remains of ether dynamics in his wake. Colin slowly turned his gaze back to me. The frantic anger evaporated, replaced by a suffocating despair. Then in front of his mother and his brother, Colin's knees buckled. He dropped to the hardwood floor, crawling forward on his hands and knees. He grabbed the hem of my trousers, his face slick with sweat and tears. "Elise, please!" Colin sobbed, a gasping cry ripping from his throat. "You have to stop this. You cannot do this to me. We were married for 7 years. I still love you. She manipulated me. Savannah convinced me to move the money. I was weak, but I am your husband. Please withdraw the dossier. We can fix this. Just do not let them send me to federal prison." I did not move. I let him kneel in the center of the grand boardroom, fully exposed to the unforgiving judgment of his peers. While Colin wept openly, the catastrophic ripple effect of his ruin hit the front row. Helen and Trevor had been watching in paralyzed shock. But as the finality of my statement sank in, the horrifying reality of their own financial situations crashed down. Trevor staggered to his feet. He looked frantically at the dossier on the table, then down at his brother. He realized his massive high-interest loans were irrevocably tied to Colin's now-dead IPO. "The margin loans," Trevor gasped in pure hysteria. "Mom, the margin loans. I leveraged everything against Colin's shares. The bank will call the loans tomorrow. We have no liquidity. They are going to take everything." The aftermath was swifter than any of them anticipated. By 8 o'clock the next morning, the financial world had caught wind of the implosion. The margin loans Trevor and Helen had so arrogantly secured triggered immediate catastrophic default clauses. At precisely 9 o'clock, the county sheriff's department arrived at my former suburban house. I watched the live security feed from my Vanguard Tower penthouse. Helen stood in the driveway, clutching her silk bathrobe tightly around her neck. Trevor stood beside her, a hollow shell. 2 uniformed deputies handed Trevor a stack of eviction notices. Because the underlying corporate assets were officially registered to Obsidian Holdings, the house legally reverted to my control. I had liquidated the asset instantly. They were forcefully evicted by the sheriff, physically removed from the property, as their arrogance was replaced by weeping desperation. They immediately faced total inescapable bankruptcy. 20 minutes later, my mobile phone vibrated. The caller ID displayed Helen's number. I let it ring 3 times before calmly answering. "Elise, thank God!" Helen wept loudly into the receiver, her breath coming in ragged bursts. "Elise, you have to stop this. The police are throwing us out onto the street. Trevor's accounts are frozen. The bank is seizing my retirement funds. We have nothing left. You have to call the bank, Elise. They are taking my car. You have the power to stop this eviction. We are blood. You cannot just leave us to starve. I will publicly apologize. I will retract everything I said online. Just wire us the money to cover the margin calls. I know Colin made a mistake, but we are family. Family forgives Elise. Family sticks together. Please, I am a mother. I am begging you on my hands and knees for mercy. You have millions. You can fix this." I leaned back in my leather chair, taking in the full measure of her absolute desperation. I delivered the final blow with surgical precision. "I am taking your advice, Helen," I said, my voice chillingly calm. "I am not letting Colin hold me back anymore." I disconnected the call and permanently blocked her number. I set the phone face down, feeling a profound silence settle over my life. The dead weight had finally been severed. Across the city, in a federal holding cell, Colin was actively trying to negotiate his way out of the abyss. Gavin patched me into a secure audio feed provided by the prosecutor's office. Colin sounded like a trapped animal. "I will give you everything on her," Colin pleaded, his voice echoing off the cinderblock walls. "Savannah orchestrated the entire offshore routing system. She manipulated the board presentations. She was the CEO. She controlled the capital flow. She was the one who forged the documents. I did not know what I was signing. Savannah manipulated the entire board of directors. I am innocent. Elise set me up because she was bitter. You have to believe me. I am a tech visionary. I do not belong in a concrete cell with actual criminals. Give me a plea deal and I will testify that she blackmailed me." He was desperately throwing Savannah under the bus, willing to sacrifice her if it meant shaving years off his prison sentence. "Mr. Vanguard," the federal prosecutor replied sharply. "We do not need your testimony. Your estranged wife provided a dossier containing irrefutable proof of every fraudulent transaction you both executed. We have your IP logs and your forged signature on a federal filing. You have absolutely zero leverage." Marcus walked into my penthouse office, placing a stack of paperwork on my desk. "It is over, Elise," Marcus announced with absolute certainty. The prosecutor officially declined Colin's request for a plea deal. Savannah's attorneys attempted to file a motion claiming she was unwitting, but Gavin's forensic audit proved she authorized the transfers. They are both facing 15 years in federal prison. Our legal team has secured an ironclad victory. I looked down at the documents, feeling the undeniable reality of my triumph. The parasitic structure that fed off my genius for 7 years was eradicated. Colin was locked in a federal cell, his arrogance having engineered his total destruction. Savannah was facing a decade behind bars. Helen and Trevor were standing on a suburban curb staring down the barrel of crushing bankruptcy. They assumed my silence was a sign of weakness. They believed my quiet dedication meant I lacked a ruthless edge. They tried to erase me, unaware I was the architect of the very floor they stood upon. "Thank you, Marcus," I said softly, turning toward the expansive windows. The city spread out before me, a glittering grid of infinite possibilities. I had successfully reclaimed my algorithm, secured my wealth, and purged the toxic liabilities from my existence. I was no longer the unassuming wife standing in the shadows of a fabricated tech genius. I was the sole proprietor of Obsidian Holdings, armed with a multi-million-dollar valuation and the undisputed rights to the most revolutionary technology on the global market. The past was permanently locked away in a federal evidence locker. The brilliant future belonged entirely to me. 3 months later, the sterile, heavily branded remnants of Ether Dynamics were nothing but a cautionary tale whispered in Silicon Valley boardrooms. I did not just rebrand the company, I completely eradicated its previous identity. Standing in the newly redesigned executive suite of Obsidian Data Core, I watched my engineering teams operate with a streamlined, vicious efficiency. The moment the federal authorities had hauled Colin and Savannah out of that boardroom, I had initiated a massive, uncompromising corporate purge. Colin had filled the executive ranks with overpaid sycophants and redundant middle managers whose only real job was to flatter his fragile ego and rubber stamp his disastrous financial decisions. I fired every single one of them by 9 in the morning. I offered generous severance packages attached to ironclad non-disclosure agreements, silencing potential leaks while excising the rot from my organization. I promoted the silent, brilliant coders Colin had continuously ignored, placing actual talent into positions of real authority. With the dead weight removed, the company transformed instantly. I stepped out of the shadows and assumed my rightful public place at the absolute helm of the operation. Without Colin constantly draining our operational funds to finance his offshore accounts and luxury purchases, capital flowed directly into research and development. My algorithm, now completely free from his incompetent meddling, and Savannah's fabricated marketing spin, performed beyond even my own initial projections. Within 6 weeks of my corporate takeover, we secured exclusive multi-billion-dollar contracts with the Department of Defense and 3 of the largest global financial institutions. Sterling, having barely survived the near miss of Colin's fraudulent initial public offering, had practically begged to lead our Series A funding round. I allowed him to participate, but strictly on my terms, maintaining an 85% controlling interest in the company. Obsidian Data Core was thriving exponentially, devoid of the hype Colin relied upon. We were dealing in pure, undeniable mathematical results. The tech industry no longer viewed my software as a flashy startup gamble. They recognized it as the foundational architecture of the future, and they finally knew exactly who had built it. I walked over to the sleek digital display mounted on the far wall of my office and tapped the screen. A live news broadcast flared to life, the chyron flashing with breaking updates. I poured myself a cup of black coffee from the carafe on my desk, leaning back against the heavy mahogany wood as the financial anchor detailed the final pathetic chapter of Colin Vanguard's fabricated empire. The sentencing hearing had concluded less than an hour ago. The presiding judge had shown absolutely zero leniency to the disgraced founders. Colin and Savannah were both officially found guilty on dozens of counts of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and federal forgery. The news segment played a brief clip of the two of them being escorted out of the federal courthouse by armed marshals. They looked utterly destroyed. Savannah had seemingly aged 10 years in the span of 3 months. Her pristine, highly contoured appearance had dissolved into a gaunt, terrified, and hollow shadow. The exact moment the FBI had seized the Cayman Island accounts and frozen the Monaco real estate assets, her profound, undying love for Colin had evaporated into thin air. During the grueling federal trial, their glamorous, powerful partnership had imploded into a vicious, ugly, and highly public spectacle. Savannah had aggressively testified against him, sobbing hysterically on the stand, claiming she was a naive victim of his grand delusions and masterful manipulation. She painted herself as an unwitting pawn in his financial crimes. Colin, enraged by her betrayal, had retaliated by releasing encrypted audio recordings of Savannah, explicitly orchestrating the offshore wire transfers and mocking the venture capitalists they were defrauding. They had mutually assured each other's absolute destruction in open court, tearing each other to shreds in a futile bid for reduced sentences. It was a spectacular display of cannibalistic greed. The anchor adjusted his papers and confirmed the final sentences. Colin Vanguard received 12 years in a federal penitentiary. Savannah received 10. There would be no early parole for federal financial crimes of that sheer magnitude. As the broadcast cut to a panel of legal experts dissecting the historic corporate collapse, I felt a deep sense of closure. They had actively tried to bury me alive to elevate themselves to the top of the financial food chain. Now they were permanently buried under the crushing weight of their own insatiable greed, locked in concrete cells while the world moved on without them. The news segment briefly mentioned the collateral damage of the massive scandal, flashing a quick file image of Helen and Trevor at a previous gala. The anchor noted they were currently facing a mountain of civil litigation from the investment banks that had issued their catastrophic margin loans. They were entirely bankrupt, publicly disgraced, and permanently exiled from the elite social circles they had sacrificed their dignity to join. They were now living in a cramped rental apartment on the outskirts of the city, working minimum wage jobs to pay off the interest on debts they could never hope to clear. I reached out and pressed the power button, plunging the screen into blackness. The audit was officially complete. The ledger was permanently balanced. I closed my laptop, the soft click echoing in the quiet, expansive space of my executive office. I gathered my tailored cashmere trench coat and my slim leather briefcase, stepping out into the bustling corridor of my corporate headquarters. My executive assistant, a highly competent woman who anticipated my needs, perfectly handed me my printed travel itinerary with a respectful nod. The private secure elevator carried me silently down to the underground parking garage, where a black executive car waited with the engine idling to take me to the international terminal. As the car merged onto the highway, I did not look back at the towering glass building holding my company. I was entirely fiercely focused on the bright horizon ahead. 2 hours later, I settled into the plush, oversized leather seat of my private first-class suite on a direct overnight flight to Paris. The cabin was a sanctuary of hushed luxury, smelling faintly of expensive cedar wood and fresh linens. A flight attendant silently approached, placing a tall crystal flute of vintage champagne on the polished mahogany armrest beside me. I thanked her with a soft, genuine smile, taking a long moment to simply sink into the seat and breathe. The heavy, suffocating pressure that had defined the last 7 years of my existence was completely, unequivocally gone. There was no longer a narcissistic husband demanding I diminish my brilliant intelligence to stroke his incredibly fragile ego. There was no Helen sitting across a dining table making snide, passive-aggressive comments about my upbringing and my lack of ambition. There was no Trevor flaunting unearned wealth and mocking my dedication to my work. And there was no Savannah scheming in the shadows to steal my future and claim my genius as her own. The toxic noise that had constantly surrounded me had been replaced by a beautiful, unbroken silence. The massive jet engines roared to life, a deep, powerful vibration that resonated through the cabin floor and reverberated in my chest. As the heavy aircraft accelerated down the illuminated runway and lifted smoothly, effortlessly into the darkening evening sky, I picked up the crystal flute. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the crisp, ice-cold champagne, letting the bright bubbles dance lightly on my tongue. I turned my head, resting against the leather headrest, and looked out the reinforced window as the sprawling, glittering grid of the city rapidly fell away beneath me, shrinking into insignificance. The aircraft climbed higher, banking sharply and piercing through a thick, heavy layer of dark storm clouds before breaking out into the blinding, brilliant gold of the upper atmosphere. The setting sun painted the endless rolling sea of clouds in rich, saturated hues of deep violet and burning orange, creating a breathtaking canvas of light and color. I watched the spectacular view, feeling a profound sense of inner calm wash over my entire body. I was 34 years old. I was sitting completely alone in a first-class cabin suspended miles above the earth, and I had absolutely never felt more profoundly, powerfully alive. I had successfully traded a toxic parasitic family for the ultimate absolute freedom that I had always known I deserved. I was no longer a silent supporting character trapped in someone else's fabricated fraudulent narrative. I was the primary architect of my own extraordinary reality, the sole author of my unfolding destiny. I took another slow, deeply satisfying sip of the expensive ice-cold champagne, watching the brilliant burning sun dip gracefully below the visible curvature of the earth. I was completely at peace, entirely untouchable, and now finally in absolute, undeniable control of my vast new empire. The future was mine.